demonstrating the impact using hands-on testing, like by an offensive cybersecurity professional, is very critical. It's like a critical aspect of pretty much anything, especially in the cloud. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new series here of SiegeCast, brought to you by Red Siege on cloud penetration testing. Today's first episode is called Cloud Pentesting Part 1. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about why are cloud penetration tests important, the differences between cloud and on-prem penetration tests, the different types of cloud-specific penetration tests themselves, and what is expected by cybersecurity consultants prior to conducting a cloud penetration test. Like what is expected of you as an organization to ensure that there's no delays and you get the best bang for your buck as far as the reporting goes. A couple other things are going to be, are cloud penetration tests even legal? Because obviously we don't own everything in the cloud. And finally, some couple of notes, but the beef of this is going to cover the different types, various types of cloud penetration tests that we do here at Red Siege. I'm here with Stuart Rohr, who is you want to introduce yourself, give a little bit of background?
Sure. Yes, my name is Stuart Rohr, and I'm one of the pen testers or security consultants at Red Siege. And I typically specialize in web and mobile, but also, as Douglas said, we do quite a bit of cloud testing. And so this is another area that we've been branching into.
Yes, and I'm Douglas. I'm a senior pen tester here at Red Siege, and I do a lot of different types of engagements. I do specifically focus on web applications and cloud pen testing. Yeah. Okay, so we got all of that crap out of the way. Who is this talk for, Stuart?
I think it's for a lot of people. It's for those who, like ourselves, are testers and they're getting into this type of testing. It's also for potential clients who are maybe trying to schedule a test of their cloud environments to try to look for the vulnerabilities. And there's always a lot of confusion there because what type of test do they exactly need for their environment? So yeah, I think there's a definite wide audience for this.
I agree. Yeah. So you have like your junior pen testers who haven't even done a cloud security assessment before, or maybe even senior pen testers. I know it seems weird to say this, but cloud pen testing is still kind of an infant. It's like evolving slowly, but it's evolving and changing and growing. And the reason why that's weird to say is because, Stuart, do you know how old? Or I'm sorry, let's start with this question. Do you know who was the very first cloud service provider?
The funny thing is, I think that there were some cloud service providers long before the ones that we typically think of. So, before AWS and such like that. I remember years ago testing environments that would have equated to cloud testing. But the first one, not a clue. Do you know?
Yeah, well, the first like large commercial, like how we consider today, was Amazon. Do you know when?
Man, it seems like it's still fairly recent, but I'm going to say maybe about a decade ago.
2006.
Wow. All right. So
It's yeah, gotcha. That's a gotcha, right? It makes me feel old.
I know.
Yeah, so that's like what, 19 years old. And we're still talking about, building up a brand new like red team, essentially focus on how to approach different services within the cloud and how to perform a cloud pen test, right? Um, Another thing that I thought was kind of cool, piece of trivia. Do you know when Kubernetes came out?
Now, I have tested Kubernetes before, and that is always a lot of fun with a dose of sarcasm. But I would say, again, somewhat still fairly recent, maybe a few years after what you were saying with Amazon, let's say maybe 2013.
Close, 2014.
All right.
Yeah. So none of this is new, though we say, everybody's moving to the cloud. So there was a lot of time in between in which cybersecurity researchers were either, under the employment of these cloud service providers, testing this stuff at the core, for the actual cloud service provider, which is something we're going to talk about in a minute. And there was a lot of things that were resolved, fixed, changed, and built out over those. If you can imagine, 19 years. That's a long time. Uh, all right, so why are cloud penetration tests important, Stuart?
Well, again, lots of different reasons. One, I mean, of course, if that is the environment that you have assets in, then right there's an importance because there are potential security risks. There's also a lot to be said for compliance related issues because a lot of companies have to meet certain types of compliance. So the cloud environments also have a part in that. They have to be tested and checked. But again, I think anytime you have some form of an asset in an environment, whether it's on premise or in the cloud, that's why it's important that it be tested for security issues.
Yes. Yeah. The infrastructure, yes, and the systems, the VMs, everything, the services you're using. But one thing that's incredibly important to think about is the data. The data itself may be under some sort of regulatory requirement to be protected, like PCI data, HIPAA data. And anytime you put, I'm sorry, you don't have to put the data. Anytime you're collecting that data, there's absolutely going to be requirements there, and those requirements are most likely going to include reviewing the security offensively. Like we're going to it's adversary simulation, so we're going to be using the same tactics, procedures of actual threat actors out in the world to help our clients understand by full hands-on demonstration what is versus what they assume is. So yes, yes, yes. Okay, next up, the differences between cloud and on-prem penetration tests.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of similarities, but I would say the differences would probably be one, the typical location. In the past, we saw most people would have their assets or infrastructure, whatever it would be, on premise on a certain specified location that a building they owned and worked out of. However, when things started to move to the cloud, it became more decentralized and it
Mhm.
was operating from, an online environment. No longer were they having to worry about doing the physical backups themselves, buying new equipment and scaling it upward. Instead, they were working within this cloud environment with virtual machines, things like that, so that it scales with them. And a lot of times it comes not always, but sometimes cheaper than, say, building up the infrastructure yourself and maintaining that cost.
Yes, and cheaper, meaning one of the ways you could consider it cheaper is by time. You're freeing up a lot of resources. If you use a more mature model than say like lift and shift, if you start building out everything inside of the cloud, you're going to lean on and leverage services that are offered by the cloud service provider and free up resources in your DevSecOps. If you have developers writing applications, your SysOps folks, in your InfoSec folks also. I mean, they'll still have a job to do. They'll still be, ensuring that everything is protected and configured properly. But there's a lot of tasks that lay on the cloud service provider. So that is absolutely um, a great response to that. What is expected by the the cybersecurity consultants before actually going into an engagement to perform a cloud penetration test? Like, what type of planning and ramp up do our clients have to do?
You know, I think that, funny enough, never really changes for any type of penetration test or security test that you're having. You always want to have as much information about the environment as possible for testing because these tests are always typically done within a specific timeline.
Mhm.
Whereas an adversary more often is going to have a lot more time to do reconnaissance on the environment. So for time centered tests, you're going to want things like API information if there's APIs involved, threat models, a very explicit scope of what is actually to be tested, what isn't to be tested. Those are all very important during an assessment. Whether there's going to be certain roles involved, if so, how many. Getting the information from the points of contact to be able to reach them in case something comes up or if there's something that needs to be reported.
Yes, exactly. So any information, as Stuart said, is going to absolutely help in these types of assessments. It's probably pretty easy to waste money by just letting them just go in and just figure things out blindly. Constant clear communication is absolutely key. When I started pen testing, I remember there was still throughout the years, there was a lot of clients that would say, "Hey, I just saw XYZ. Was that you? Hey, I just saw this. Did you do that? Hey, we just saw that somebody had accessed whatever. Did you do that?" And that's clear communication. That's great. And I could say yes or no. And if it's no, I get a little bit scared. But what we do is we turn the table around and we start asking all of those questions. So going back to the previous question I just asked you, Stuart, about the difference between on-prem and cloud, one of the biggest difference, obviously, like you mentioned, was that the clients may not own everything that we typically pen test in a network pen test on-prem, especially the actual core network, all of that stuff. That's all considered, I think so. It's considered like off limits for a pen test. And each cloud service provider has their own rules and regulations and guidelines that you absolutely have to follow. And as we turn that table around, we start asking questions like, "Hey, I found this. Is this in scope? I found this. Is this yours?" And in doing so, we create a constant conversation, which truly helps during that. But as much information as possible up front, maps, threat models, anything that you want to give to the pen tester. Obviously we're under an NDA. We're not going to leak that information. It's one way to consider this type of engagement or assessment is to always consider the fact that pen testers are working with you. We're on the same team and we have the same exact goal. Unless you don't have goals and you're just like having to do the pen test per like because auditors were like, you have to do a pen test, and you're like, oh gosh, not again. Like it's if outside of that mentality, we're all on the same page and we all just want to ensure that your data is in fact absolutely as secure as possible by performing a adversary simulation. So moving a little bit, with that part of the conversation, Stuart, are cloud pen tests even illegal if we don't own everything that's in the cloud?
So usually the prerequisites for cloud testing, with at least within the major ones like Google Cloud, AWS, and Azure, is that pen testing is allowed from that client perspective as long as we're not hitting things that are specifically infrastructure based from the provider side, or performing certain types of tests like denial of service, anything that would be potentially destructive. As long as we're just testing the implementation of our client, we should be in the clear.
Absolutely. There's definitely hard, like carved in stone things that we can't do. For instance, if we had a client that did perform a lift and shift, and say they have a VM that they're running Kubernetes out of to create containers or manage them, they're doing everything themselves. And if we're pen testing that from the initial foothold of a container escape is allowed, right? Now, for instance, if they are building everything out and leaning on the resources that they should be in the cloud. Like, for instance, in GCP, we have Google Kubernetes engine, right? And say we're given access to a container that was built using that. Container escaping is not part of the scope because essentially you would get out of that and you would be in Google's resources, and that's absolutely off limits.
That's right.
Yes, exactly. All right, so let's define the different black, gray, and white box assessments for cloud pen testing. So in a black box assessment, black box means there's no light. I think I always think of it this way: the Schrodinger experiment, in which there was the box, there was the black box experiment. What's in there? Is the cat that's sitting in there with the uranium still alive or plutonium, whatever it is, Homer Simpson? And so we have no visibility. We're going in there blind. This is probably good for Many reasons, and specifically for a very specific type of, actually, two specific types of tests. The external penetration test, in which the client provides a large scope of IP, external facing IP addresses, in which we're just performing an external pen test against resources that are hosted in our client's virtual cloud, private cloud. Or if we're doing an internal pen test from the standpoint of, say, we gained access to a system through some sort of vulnerability, and we want to see, and your client wants to see whether or not they can detect, alert, and stop that as quickly as possible, right? The gray box, however, we get a lot of information. We get the scope of the internal um, resources that we're supposed to pen test. We're provided some information about, the background and stuff, and things in scope absolutely to target, like pain points, stuff like that. The white box, however, this is what we were just talking about before, in having as much information, as many conversations as possible leading up to the actual cloud penetration test, where we know exactly the paths that we need to take, or how we can be creative and get around those paths to get, to find authorization issues for the data, for instance, that's under the compliance, like I guess the crown jewels, the goal of the assessment, testing whether or not, say, for instance, a health provider, can we access HIPAA data and how? And we review all of these maps and such, and we create these in our head, and we just go through it. That the white box assessment is absolutely going to be I think there's different words for all of these too, but that's going to be the best bang for the buck for the report, and obviously for the safety of your data, as far as testing it from um, not only a, you know, a threat, not only as a threat actor who just got in there and has no idea what's going on, but you get the peace of mind that, somebody else, a third party, has reviewed all of this and given you their absolute best recommendations and advice per the penetration testing guidelines and frameworks and such. In all scenarios, we're going to be doing adversary simulation no matter what. But the more information that you can provide up front, the better, honestly.
Yeah. So, Douglas, I think one of the things, with all of those that you were talking about that is important is the context. And um, Lizzie Moratti, who was previously at Rhino, had mentioned context being important. And I think context in this essence is kind of what you were talking about again, like maybe the goal behind the assessment, combined with any types of restrictions, such as like the allowed amount of time that is involved for testing, because that's going to affect the test in and of itself, the outcome, what will be potentially be found. You can even throw in like scenario type testing. A client could say, well, this is where our valuable resources are. This is an area that we really want tested. We want to see if this is something you're able to get to. You mentioned escaping out of containers. That could also be a form of context for testing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's important even before, vetting different types of cybersecurity firms to conduct these cloud penetration tests, because, like you just said, we kind of have like almost like a Venn diagram, a marriage of like what the pen testers can do, what the cybersecurity firm can do, and also what needs to be tested. So the stuff that meets in the middle, that's going to be, like the absolute best, and you want that as big as possible. So for instance, if a cloud pen test gets, offered to a cybersecurity firm, they can go through their folks and their skill sets and apply the correct, folks for the job. So yeah, context is very, very important. That's a good subject. The different types of services, like as a service, that we test during um, cloud penetration tests, are going to be your infrastructure as a service, IaaS, your software as a service, SaaS, and your platform as a service, PaaS. Stuart, would you like to talk about the differences of those?
Sure. So your infrastructure as a service, that's typically going to be things like workstations, servers, networks. Typically you're going to be doing some form of like a basic internal network test that's involving virtual servers and workstations. You're assessing the security of cloud hosted machines, servers, the code installed on each. You're looking for misconfigurations that could potentially lead to, say, remote access or maybe even something as simple as disclosing information, which unfortunately we see all the time, sensitive information being disclosed, maybe for instance through like an S3 bucket for AWS. So you're beginning these assessments usually by being provided with some sort of like a VPC access. Um, I think you've mentioned in the past some where you've had a Kali instance that that's been deployed and they put you in there for that, the purpose of that assessment. So that's typically what would be involved in IaaS.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's not really like you start from a standpoint of, say, an assumed breach or anything like that. It's more akin to like straight up internal network pen tests just within their cloud environments with very specific targets, and scope.
And then I think next we have the software as a service. And so, that's usually where third party software solutions have been deployed within the client's cloud environment. And the goal primarily there is maybe trying to perform, say, like privilege escalation and data exfiltration, um, something along those lines.
Yeah, there's not really much to do with that, typically. Though we've done those before in the past for different types of software that's being deployed, that wasn't made by the client, essentially, in those instances, another thing that the clients can consider is that they can request a penetration test report or maybe some sort of SOC 2 type 2 report from the vendor, the software vendor. That may help in that situation also. And the last one is platform as a service.
Yeah, so those are going to be like an assessment of the cloud container platform software, that the developers use to say, quickly develop and deploy their web applications. Um, Client might use something like Kubernetes, and this is going to include things like web applications, desktop applications. So there's going to be some testing of those types of things involved, especially things maintained by the clients in their cloud environment. You can think of, bring your own software, which is deployed in those containers. The containers usually adhere to some form of like an isolation where they're sharing the underlying OS kernel, but they have their own file system, network stacks. And so that's typically what you're thinking of for that. Testing would be something uh, it's going to include software that's deployed in a cloud environment where the scope is defined by the client, and maybe and often they're trying to meet some form of regulatory requirement, compliance. So that's usually something that is going to be checked. Now, this typically would not include, and I think you touched on this just a little while ago, things like escaping the containers and the host OS itself, because then that would be going outside of the scope.
Yes. Yeah, and each cloud security provider, I'm sorry, cloud service provider is going to have their own guidelines, and those guidelines are open. Like you could just read about them if you want to, if you haven't already. Before choosing a cloud service provider, or even if you already have, it's good to at least review those documents at least once by the InfoSec team.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Finally, the beef of the conversation, the different types of assessments that we perform in the cloud, right? I will begin with the assumed breach assessment, if you don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. Go right ahead.
All right, so this is going to be a white box assessment for sure, and it starts with access. So assumed breach, obviously the name itself is self-defining. It's like, what if, for instance, a web application had SQL injection and we didn't know about it, and a threat actor took advantage of that and gained access to a backend system in our cloud environment? What can they do, right? Or maybe a workstation, like some sort of VDI or something. I'm sorry, some sort of VM or something in our cloud environment. Somebody was using it and they got phished. And can can C2 software call back to a C2? Like, those types of things we go through and we test them out as far as the detection, the alerting and stuff goes. We start from an actual standpoint somewhere inside as we assume that there is a breach. Like, what is a threat actor going to do? So the different phases are kind of the same as a regular assumed breach, except you're within a cloud environment. So you're going to do your situational awareness. You're going to go through and try local privilege escalation, enumeration, Persistence. How do you maintain access? And is that even possible? We love to demonstrate all of this in our reports. Vulnerability analysis. Are there any vulnerabilities? Probably not, as far as software goes, right? Exploitation and again, post exploitation to essentially, is there, if we're in a domain, can we escalate privileges within a domain? It's just like a regular assumed breach would be for an on-prem network, but it's in the cloud. And demonstrating the impact using hands-on testing, like by an offensive cybersecurity professional, is very critical. It's like a critical aspect of pretty much anything, especially in the cloud, because there may be some services and some solutions that are there to protect you that you may not understand why they're protecting you or how to configure them. And the tester should be able to demonstrate, is there a way to skirt around that, essentially get around it and access the very sensitive data or perform that privilege escalation. And again, these are absolutely white box assessments. We get as much data upfront as possible and we gain access to a system. One thing I would love to note here is that if you are under regulatory requirements in which you have to perform a cloud penetration test, I highly recommend the assumed breach. And also, if you're planning on partaking in an assumed breach assessment in the cloud, absolutely um, clone a system that's being used by a user. Clone maybe a server, like a web application server, or something like that, that has organic like user data on it. That way, it's more of like a real world example or demonstration of what a threat actor is going to do once they gain access to that system. Because one of the very first thing in the situational awareness, can I find human created data that contains credentials or sensitive information that allow me to move laterally or even privesk, so that's very important to consider during any assumed breach assessments rather than get a fresh system spun up. That seems a fresh system and assumed breach to me seems more like just a regular internal network pen test where you just focused a bunch on AD, which I've done in the past, years ago in the past. Like it's cybersecurity is maturing so quickly, that like this is absolutely very critical to ensure that everybody's on the same page as far as like even the language goes surrounding the assumed breach. But
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, with all the different types that we're discussing, the student breach is definitely the most comprehensive. It's like going into the doctor and having a full checkup, full blood work, scans, whatever, to test for something in comparison to the others that, we'll be going through. So I agree with you. I think if you're going to have one for your environment and you really want the best bang for your buck, it's definitely the one to consider.
absolutely.
So I think the next one is the external. So one of the things that you'll find, of course, within most of these is that there will be some similarities. And so with the external based types of testing, um, this is going to be more similar to doing a typical external network pen test for your environment or a web application test. There's going to be a lot of reconnaissance, enumeration, scanning, the typical types of stuff. Usually there's no access provided by the client, such as giving actual credentials to log in. It's usually from, like, again, externally focused, trying to get in from the outside. It's often used to demonstrate what is accessible by an unauthorized actor. So, um, again, very similar to what you do within the external network pen tests and web application assessments. They're also typically more gray box. So there is a defined scope. And of course, vitally, you need to have that technical client POC available that can assist you if something goes wrong, if you get, some form of on the deny list, so that's always important. And of course, one of the primary goals for the person doing the assessment is going to be trying to attempt to gain access to whatever resources are there, especially those that they find during the reconnaissance period, and then potentially trying to exploit those services or the code that they have available.
Yeah, absolutely. Like management consoles with default passwords on them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Still happens.
Yeah, unprotected buckets or other types of resources. I think you and I even talked about, because there's a comparison to web application testing for this one specifically, where I've found where maybe a web application incorporates S3 buckets into their environment. And I've been able to get cross-site scripting by uploading things into that they later incorporate into their site. So, that's something to check for.
Absolutely. They're leveraging the platform as a service, you know. Usually the web applications that the developers from our clients are building is part of that type of assessment also, yeah.
And I think that leads us to the configuration security scans, which again, those are typically the types of things you see more on the compliance side. And the objective for these are typically looking for human error. And honestly, with in-cloud environments, that's probably the biggest cause of problems because we're human, we make mistakes. And in the configuration process, sometimes, the policies are too generous, or a role has been assigned too much privilege. So it's very easy to do that. I do believe over the years, the environments have gotten a lot better at the default and trying to
Mm.
lock things down. But unfortunately, this is still an issue. So these types of tests are typically and often done by the auditors. They run different types of tools, proprietary tools, where they're available for purchase, or open source tools. I think we talked about Prowler, Douglas, being a common open source tool, but it also has a pay model as well, I think, for doing, I think, accessing more or whatever. And then you even have in-house tools that some companies are writing on their own to perform
Yeah.
these assessments, which is pretty cool.
I
And
love getting access to those. That's cool.
yeah, I mean, it's always fun to see how another person's approach is toward looking for misconfigurations. You can
And the
always learn.
comparison between the two, you know, something that we're using versus something they built. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so typically these tools are going to spit out what types of like security issues there are with the misconfigurations. I like to think of these sort of like the WinPs of and LinPs of the cloud world, where you like run these tools when you're on a machine to try to see what type of escalation vectors there might be. And so it's the same thing. So we'll point out like, here is an overly generous role. And oh, guess what? You have that role. So those are the types of things that those are really, really good at finding. And, honestly, those types of tools are not just restricted to this type of testing. You would want to run those, like for instance, in the A/B type of assessment we mentioned before.
Yeah, yeah, or just be provided the output. That helps too, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, they can run it themselves and provide the output.
But the human error that you mentioned, yes, and, you know, I feel like that's less of the case, and I feel like it's more of haste.
Oh,
Or
it's
maybe, like, ignorance, a little bit of ignorance, you know, it's
Oh,
just
yeah. I mean, I think that those are the case. Yeah. Again, I think that the environments themselves are doing a lot better job at locking things down than what they were years ago. But then people are going in and editing the roles and the configurations and the policies.
Mhm.
Uh, we've
Yeah,
both worked in environments where before, security fields where we've been like network or whatever administrators, and we've had higher ups come to us and say, well, we really do need this port open. And we're like, that's a security risk. But they're like, we really do need this port open. I'm like, all right. And it's like at your own risk. And so that's kind of the same thing I think we see within these environments. Someone's like, yeah, well, we really need this to be done, even though we know it's not the best security, decision to be made. And that's what usually bites people in the butt.
yes. Yes, absolutely, and I've seen it. I've seen it all.
But
Alright, so there's one more, right?
yeah, penetration test. And
Like
so,
in yeah.
yeah, so those are the types of assessments that really aren't that different again from your simple network pen test. And this the difference between the earlier assessment that we spoke about is that the client might provide the testers with access to, say, like a Kali instance. Again, similar to what you've experienced in the past. I know you've done these types of assessments before. And these are also typically gray box assessments, and you are provided access. There is a defined scope.
Yeah.
We sort of talked about sort of the rinse, wash, and repeat of doing reconnaissance, enumeration, scanning, the works. That's going to happen again in this type of assessment. The difference with penetration tests, aside from say the assumed breach, is that your objective is it's more to uncover as many issues as possible within the time frame, and that's for the pen testers. That's always sort of like the living nightmare because I don't know about you, Douglas, but I've had many nightmares where I'm like, oh, did I cover everything? And because you're only given within like a certain time. So that's the primary objective for that. Now, these types of tests also could include different types of roles. Just as in a typical pen test, there might be a manager role or a very restricted read-only role. And so you're expected to test from each of those and look for different types of escalation.
Yes. And one more key item, the vulnerabilities that we uncover, demonstration, like hands-on demonstration, real world, like hacking demonstration of why these risks or these vulnerabilities need to be reviewed and, taken care of as soon as possible or not. Some of them are just observations like, hey, look what I found.
Right, right. And of course, sometimes there are issues within a company why something cannot be done. And so
Yeah.
then the objective is to try to protect around it. Just like a broken bone, you might not be able to fix it in the moment, but you want to try to provide the best supporting structure around it so that it can hopefully heal and you can fix it when you can and hopefully as soon as possible.
Yes. Yeah. Resources, change management, red tape, whatever. It's gonna all just drown everybody anyway, right? But if we can show, like, hey, this is bad. This is what I was talking about before when I said infosec pain points. I remember I was a blue teamer for almost 2 years, right? An infosec engineer, and there were stuff that absolutely kept me awake at night because I was just I knew it just needed to be fixed immediately. But the best way to demonstrate that is to like exploit it, take advantage of it, right? Just because like it may hit a certain level inside of your organization where folks may not understand why it's important. And the pen tests absolutely the reports, if they're not showing that, you should come to Red Siege for your next pen test. Yeah. Yeah, but, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Stuart, have you ever been on one of these assessments in which you're like an internal network pen test in the cloud or even on-prem, but in the cloud, more importantly, in which you're provided a scope, but you notice that there's things that probably should not be in the scope, that may not be owned by the client?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes, many times. And that typically involves a very quick call to the client, a discussion about, here's this thing I found. It should not be in scope. I cannot test this. You're going to have to find a way either to get permission for me to test it, or it's just going to be, taken out of the scope. So that does happen. And again, that's why it's so important when these are being discussed pre-test that those types of things are identified. I mean, sadly, it's true. We do have times when we're speaking with clients and they include things that they think they might have control over, but they don't. I mean, there's always potential misinformation. So, again, it's really good that those things are vetted. And then as the pen testers and security consultants, that we have our eyes open and we can identify those quickly so that we don't attack something obviously that we shouldn't.
Absolutely, and there are some cases, these are sometimes provided insider ranges, and
Mm,
sometimes there's just 1 or 2 things in there that we weren't supposed to touch, maybe not even owned by the client, but part of their network, right? And some of those things may even get us like blocked access or something. So it's very, very important to ensure that the scope has been reviewed internally by an organization before even approaching a cybersecurity firm for pen tests, especially specifically cloud.
yeah, I definitely agree. But I think the one thing we can all agree upon is that cloud testing, even though we've determined it really isn't 100% new, it's newer. And there's a lot of interesting crossovers between, typical network pen testing and hybrid web testing because it's including both environments. And, I think right now it's sort of the it area that people are finding issues with. And they definitely need to be tested for security issues.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. So that wraps up the conversation for today's episode. So what we learned was the different. Well, first of all, why this is important. Why is a cloud penetration test important? And we learned the different types of as a service services that are either in scope or out of scope, and how they essentially define the type of assessment that you may want to approach the cybersecurity forum for. We learned about the different types of penetration testing within the cloud. And with a few examples, we have the assume breach, the internal, external, the even the cloud configuration scan, which sometimes could be even done by auditors themselves. But the report's very important with the demonstration. Like I'm one of those people that when I'm learning, different colors and images really help me to remember things or even understand stuff, especially images. I'm one of those people that like thinks in like, I don't know, I can think of conceptual space really easily, and I use that as like understanding how things work. And without understanding how they work, I can't really fix issues with it, right? And so the pen test report should be something like that, something tangible that's going to help not only demonstrate why this stuff is important, why these findings need to be reviewed, and also it's like education kind of, people can read it and say, oh, so threat actors are going to try this and this and this. Oh, I just thought of something. I could go, there was something that wasn't tested that we can go and check ourselves, just using the methodology of the report, because it needs to be, the methodology of the report obviously needs to be repeatable by the IT department. So that's very important. And it should inspire folks internally in your organization when they're reading it to take steps further to like really try to understand what's going on inside of everything inside the cloud, even the systems, the authorization stuff, the identity access management stuff, all of that that's tested in these assessments. It should open up doors, start conversations like this. Yeah. In the next episode, we're going to be learning about the different types of cloud training labs for pen testers, folks who are learning about how to perform or conduct penetration tests or security assessments within your client's cloud.